So, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here this evening. One of the things that we've, the reason for pulling this town hall together, we've been undertaking a number of exercises over the last number of years, and as we've been going through planning board sessions and some of our township committee sessions, it became more and more evident that there's sort of a knowledge gap within the public as to how we've gotten to where we are, some of the history around the affordable housing impacts, and where we are going as a community in terms of our affordable housing requirements. So we wanted to bring a session together so that we could have some information shared with you. We will have time for Q&A at the end if there's things that we don't cover that you'd like still an understanding on, or you have questions on. We've got a number of people and professionals here that I hope can answer whatever issues you may have as it relates to affordable housing. And if we don't, we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible on any further issues that may come up. Maybe as we go through, just to introduce the rest of the people here up on the dais with me. Eric Bernstein to my left is our Affordable Housing Council. Deputy Mayor Doug Thompson. Joining us shortly will be Holly Shapizi, legislator out of the 39th District. She is en route, but had a little bit of a traffic issue, so she'll be joining us relatively shortly, and will be one of our panelists and guest speakers in a little bit. We have Jennifer Beam, who is our affordable housing consultant with the firm of Avakian. She's been our affordable housing consultant since, I believe, 2006 now. So she's very well versed on all matters impacting Hillsborough. We have our administrator, Anthony Ferreira, and our planner, David Maskey, up on the dais as well. So I want to thank our panelists for being here, certainly the Assemblywoman when she arrives, and thank you all for being here, because I think it's an important topic. It's affecting everyone in the state, not just here in Hillsborough. And I think there's been significant recognition in the state for really a number of decades at this point of the need for affordable housing in New Jersey that's going to accommodate certain elements of our population. We do have a number of professions and roles and jobs that simply the state is becoming unaffordable from a housing perspective, and I think there is recognition and justifiably so of the need for some affordable housing in town. Hillsborough has also recognized this need, and we've been relatively proactive in our effort to help fill the need and to meet the requirements as they have been laid out by our court process. However, after even several decades of court battles, Supreme Court mandates, Supreme Court, what I'll say, legislating from the bench, and legislative inaction, we remain as a state conflicted about how we solve the affordable housing problem and how we go about fulfilling the noble goal of meeting our affordable housing requirements. The purpose tonight is not to relitigate how we eventually got to the affordable housing Supreme Court mandates, not to relitigate the Mount Laurel decision, which was really the genesis of the state's affordable housing battles. But nor do I intend to use this forum tonight as a means to malign and criticize the concept of affordable housing and its place within the government role that myself and my colleagues here in Hillsborough have responsibility for. Rather, what our plan is tonight is to educate the public on how we've gotten to where we are today, some of the actions that we've taken, the history we've undertaken as a community to help meet the requirements that we have, and to give you some guidance as to where we see the process going forward. So what we'll be doing tonight is provide updates on Hillsborough's actions to date, outline some of the deficiencies, both legislative and court mandated within the current system, and the corresponding impact that's having on our community. We're going to summarize the scope of the projects that we're undertaking to help fulfill our obligations, and make sure we've got the professionals here ready to answer your questions as a Q&A. So, how do we get here? So Hillsborough, as a community, has been operating under a Supreme Court, under the Supreme Court to fulfill its obligations through affordable housing since about 2002. Back in 2002, we received what's called a judgment of repose from the Supreme Court, which is essentially an extension of the statute of limitations for what was then the round 2 obligations, which effectively ended in 1999. The second round obligations that we were tasked with was 461 units, and that was satisfied primarily through what were called regional contribution agreements, which basically allowed communities to share their obligations. So giving and receiving communities could share that obligation. If there were some that needed affordable housing, we could provide them to the other communities, and we worked that a lot through agreements with both Manville and Phillipsburg. Unfortunately, RCAs are no longer permissible under the current affordable housing requirements. So I know there is some view in legislation to try to bring that back, but as we said today, that's no longer part of the process. So then round 3, which officially began in 1999, however, there were no regulations that were officially established until 2005. The growth share calculations at that time in the 2005 requirements were basically 1 affordable unit for every 8 market units and 1 affordable unit for every 25 jobs created within the municipality. As part of the ongoing battles with the court system, those rules got invalidated in 2008. And then new growth share requirements were established, which essentially said instead of 1 for 8, it was 1 affordable unit for every 5 market units that were established, and 1 affordable unit for every 15 jobs that were part of the growth in the community. The obligations for Hillsborough under that scenario, under that new growth share requirement, was 475 units. So in 2010, we put in a plan that would essentially help us meet that obligation. We had a number of projects that were outlined, all part of our full plan to meet that obligation. And once again, the rules got invalidated. But we knew that even though those rules got invalidated again, that we would be in a similar position in the not too far distant future. So we essentially took the plan that we had and we continued to work that plan under the 475 units that we had. And we've continued to work that since that time. It wasn't until the spring of 2015, I'm sorry, that the Supreme Court essentially took back the affordable housing rules from what the time was the Coalition on Affordable Housing, and moved it then to under the court process, which is kind of where we sit, continuing today. So there's a number of vicinages that that the municipalities work with to develop what their final plan and obligation will be. We remain in that process today. We're working with our local vicinage to ultimately get to what our settled requirement will be. I don't have that number for you, so I'm sure someone will ask. We don't have that yet because we're not fully settled yet. but we continue to work the process to allow us to meet what we know will ultimately be a fairly significant obligation, whatever the number will be. So we have started to implement a number of projects that will help us meet that requirement when it ultimately reaches our settlement. And you've seen some of that in some of our recent planning board processes. We've seen that in some of our zoning requirements where we've established zones that will allow us to meet some of our affordable housing requirements. And that's beginning to be implemented because we know that eventually we have to meet that requirement. We don't really have the benefit of saying we're not going to comply. It's simply not something that is an option for us. One of the, I guess, nice things and sort of the downside of being a community such as ours that frankly people want to come to and want to live in is we have no shortage of developers that are willing to build out all of the requirements that we have, all the requirements that we would ever need to help us meet our affordable housing requirements. And they're known as what we call interveners. So they're in the process, and they are the ones that we work with ultimately to fulfill the obligations that we're going to have to move forward with. So we have no shortage of them because, frankly, we know that people, if houses get built here, people will want to move here. It's been the case for a number of years, and I would expect that to continue into the future. At some point, though, the process becomes difficult for the municipality to handle. When you consider that for one for every 5 or 1 for every 4 is what the requirements will be, you can look at what your affordable housing mandate will be, and whatever that number is, you have to multiply that by 4 or 5 to get to ultimately how many new houses will be built in a given community. So if you just use our 475 units that was part of the last round, that alone would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 units in total that would need to be built to meet the requirement. So whatever we end up with going forward, whatever that settled number is, those are kind of the numbers that need to be thought of in terms of ultimately what our requirement will be. So where does that leave us today? Today we're in a state where situation, not state in the New Jersey sense. We're in a situation where we are one of the few remaining municipalities that have not fully settled our obligation. There are some, but we're sort of on the tail end of that, and that gives us some. Mainly, that's because we've been trying to optimize that number as much as possible, minimize the impact to the community, while understanding that we want to have some affordable housing. We're trying to ensure that it's not burdensome to the community and the services and the resources and the existing homeowners in town. So we've started to put in place, as I said earlier, some of the steps that we know will be required in order for us to take that next level to meet those obligations. Zoning, starting to develop site plans with some developers that we know will be ultimately part of our affordable housing plan, and continue to work that process so that we are continuing to show our commitment to the process and work with the courts and Fair Share Housing Center to indicate that we recognize our commitment to the process, but we also want to ensure that we're not burdened beyond what our means would be. The process to determine ultimately the final settlement has been an ongoing process with the courts and with Fair Share. They look at, in order to help determine ultimately what our obligation will be, we look at the number of buildable acres and space in town. So being a community of our size, with significant acreage of what could be deemed as buildable space, that all plays into ultimately what our obligation will be. Fortunately, we have professionals and consultants that have been doing this for quite some time and are working aggressively on our behalf with us to help to minimize that impact as much as possible. But that's essentially where we are today. It's been a protracted court process, really since the late 1999s, the late 1990s, that's gotten us still to this point. And the obligations, the requirements, the calculations, the rules and regulations that have been provided to us by the state are constantly changing. As we've seen, a number of the requirements have been invalidated only to be replaced with more onerous restrictions. So we need to continue to work our process so that, again, we show that we are committed, we're working in good faith to help meet the needs of the state, but we can't just simply accept a figure that's provided to us by Fair Share and the courts without that ongoing protracted discussion around ultimately how do we manage that as a community. I think we all wish we weren't within a court process, but the reality is that's how the setup has been implemented by the state at this point. It would be nice if we could get to the point where there was a legislative solution to this. And let's make no mistake about it, there has been very little in the way of leadership or action by the legislature that could really resolve this problem for us or could remove it from the courts. They have had ample opportunities. They have had ample time, and we never get to the point where there is a legislative fix, so the courts continue to intervene. And that's really why we continue to have a process that is driven by the courts and not driven by the legislature. We are not alone as a community. We are in the same boat as every other municipality in the state of New Jersey. Our situation is a bit unique, mainly because of the size and scope of our community, but the process and the requirements are the same issues that municipalities are going throughout the state. So we need to continue to be diligent in what we do and how we plan, how we negotiate, and ultimately how we work with our consultants and partners, but more importantly, how we work with the courts and Fair Share to get to a reasonable, fair, equitable solution that we can say we're helping to solve some of the problem of affordable housing in the state, and again, not being overly burdensome to the municipality that I think we all enjoy being here and living in. So with that, Eric, turn it over to you. You next. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bernstein, as again he's our Affordable Housing Counsel, has been for the better part of 15 years, give or take.
In some capacity.
And to share some additional thoughts on the topic.
Before we pull it over and we make the guy in the back crazy. Thank you. Am I coming through, Kaz? Okay. If any of you have been to a planning board, one of Kaz, who is in the back, main function is to tell us that somebody is talking close enough to the mic to be heard on the screen. You've heard some of the mayor's comments, some of which I would probably have made myself, so let me try to give a little history, probably talk about some of the actions or inactions and where we are in terms of the process. For a little history, you have all heard that this is Mount Laurel, and there's a reason why it's been called Mount Laurel, because there was two original decisions out of the Supreme Court in the late 1970s out of Mount Laurel, because Mount Laurel would not allow trailer parks to be built in Mount Laurel Township because they thought that was the kind of affordable housing we didn't need. That created the round one and a series of obligations created by the legislature. That didn't necessarily work through the Council on Affordable Housing and the Fair Housing Act. So we ended up with a second Mount Laurel case, what is known as Mount Laurel 2, which ultimately presented another round of obligations. And in both round one and round two, the municipalities were all given numbers. And ostensibly, one of several things happened. Either the municipalities tried to comply and did. The municipalities, especially out in suburbia, tried to comply by creating sites that were, as they claimed, as developable as possible when in fact they weren't. Or they looked the other way. And what was allowed under both Mount Laurel 1 and Mount Laurel 2 was known as a builder's remedy suit. And basically what that was when your immunity expired at the end of a round, a developer could come in and say he or she is ready, willing, and able to build all the municipality's obligations. That is what happened here in Hillsborough in round two. We were a builder's remedy town. One or more developers came in and sued the township, which ultimately led to a resolution crafted by the then Special Master, Elizabeth McKenzie, back in 1999-2000, which led to, unfortunately, a lack of maximization or optimization of the possibilities for affordable housing here in Hillsborough, which we're now having to deal with in round 3/4 because we didn't accumulate additional credits. As the mayor indicated, once the immunity came about and came to an end, and the problem, frankly, for those of us in this business, and I represent not only Hillsborough but 5 other towns across the state, is that we really, unlike round, first of all, we're not sure what round this is. This has been dragging on since 1998 and is supposed to end in 2025, and what the courts have said on multiple occasions was no matter what the rules created were, they weren't sufficient. Fair share housing would go back to the courts and claim they did not adequately address affordable housing, and the courts, predominantly the appellate division, agreed on at least 3 occasions. Council on Affordable Housing was sent back on a number of occasions to try to deal with it. They chose to deal with it poorly. The legislature, and in the absence of the Assemblywoman, both parties of the legislature and multiple administrations have basically looked the other way, hoping it would all go away, and it didn't, mostly because Fair Share wouldn't let it go away. So what ultimately happened is we are in round 3, sort of round 4, trying to make up for more than 20 years of past obligations and another 5 to 6 years of going forward obligations, all in a basically 5-year period, with some exception. And frankly, one of those exceptions happens to be Hillsborough. Hillsborough recognized early on, after round 2, and continued through the 2000s to try to address the issue as best as it possibly could based on whatever rules were in existence at the moment. Jen, I think, will actually talk about the fact that we were within 30 days of approval for immunity on this round when they changed the court rules. Well, pardon me, when they changed the affordable housing rules again. And they've been changed multiple times. In 2015, the mayor indicated the Supreme Court decided that they had had enough and said, none of you are doing what you were supposed to be doing. We have tried every way, shape, or form to get you to do what's supposed to be done, and you have left us with no alternative but to ostensibly intervene, for lack of a better phrase, and they took over. And one of the key changes that occurred in what is known as Justice Lavecchia's decision, which is in Re NJAC 5:96 and 5:97, is to put the Fair Share Housing Center at every table. So they now have an automatic place at the table in every town that has sought immunity. What the court also agreed to do, which was a benefit to municipalities, was rather than saying you will now start out in the back, basically everybody was given immunity. If you file the plan within 60 days of the court decision, you were granted initial immunity. Now the thought was that this would last about 6 months. We are now in year 4 with no end in sight. So Hillsborough filed its immunity request, and then the fun started. The mayor indicated vicinage. We actually have an interesting meeting here because the court basically divvied up the case obligations to the various court vicinages. And here in Hillsborough, we are in a 3-county vicinage with Somerset, Hunterdon, and Warren. However, the housing region for this municipality is Middlesex, Somerset, Hunterdon. So we've literally had 2 different judges, Judge Miller for Somerset and Hunterdon, and Judge Wolfson before he retired from Middlesex, dealing with the region while Judge Miller was dealing with the vicinage. We then got the unfortunate benefit, as the mayor indicated, because this is one of the best places to live here. That's partially true. The other part of it that's equally true is you have too much land.
I like my part better.
Absolutely. And I agree with the mayor on that part. Unfortunately, you have too much developable land. And you have numerous developers who are more than happy to build something they really don't want to build. What initially happened was Fair Share and the New Jersey Builders Association got in bed together. That lasted just about as long as Fair Share figured out that the builders really didn't want to build affordable housing. And we have faced that problem throughout this entire process of explaining to people that we expect if you're going to build, you're going to build affordable housing. What used to occur was what we called a builder's remedy and a density bonus. These are 2 catchphrases. Builder's remedy, as I mentioned earlier, was a builder who was willing to build out of the goodness of his or her heart and do so. Many of you may be familiar with the largest builder's remedy affordable housing in the state of New Jersey. Drive up 206 to 287, drive up 287, and you will see the hills. That is the largest affordable housing builder's remedy development in the state of New Jersey. It goes into 3 towns, it goes up that hill, and I hate to say it, you know where the affordable housing is because it's the front of the development. And there is a distinct difference between the units that are affordable and the ones that aren't. That obviously was an objective the court did not want to see happen. So they granted immunity to municipalities who filed. And Hillsborough was one of over 320 towns that basically filed for immunity. The remaining towns either figured there's no land in town worth building, come at us, or we actually have so much affordable housing we don't need any more, come at us. Or, for those of you who are familiar with the shore communities, almost nobody at the shore is in the lawsuits because there is nowhere to build and there's nowhere to build affordable housing. And they said, please come at us and try it. So we got immunity, and the courts have indicated they will continue to give immunity as long as the municipality continues to show its ability to create an affordable plan. They will only grant builder's remedy if all options have been exhausted and the municipality is refusing to cooperate. And there are some towns that have fit into that one. The one that comes to mind and the one closest here is South Brunswick, which is currently at the Supreme Court fighting because they basically would not go along. The other part was density bonus. Nobody wants to build affordable housing. Come on up, Assemblywoman. For those of you, I'll introduce this, the Assemblywoman Holly Shapizi from the 39th Legislative District in Northern Bergen County. we are already willing and able to build housing we don't want to build. And because we don't want to build it, and because we are only doing it out of the goodness of our hearts, and you can all tell, for those of you who know me, know this is very tongue-in-cheek, we need to build more units because there is no money to be made in building affordable units, so we need to build more market rate units than we really need in order to make money, and therefore we are entitled to what is ostensibly been called a density bonus. We have vehemently fought that entire concept in this round. And I think we have been and we are going to continue to be successful in eliminating that issue, which is, oh yes, we need to build 7,000 market rate units so we can build 6 affordable on this site, basically turning this into, you know, one more town of 80,000 people, which is obviously not the objective. So what has put us in this situation? As I indicated earlier, developable land. The second piece of the puzzle was failure to maximize the last round. And the third piece of the puzzle, fortunately or unfortunately, well, actually 2 others. The third piece that we do not know, and this has been a constant problem the governing body has faced, the planning board has faced, and those of us who do this for a living have faced. We don't know our number. There have been multiple trials, both down in Monmouth, in Ocean, in Mercer, relative to numbers, and I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, they have not been favorable to the municipalities at all. The League of Municipalities went out and hired 2 different consultants to deal with the Fair Share Housing's consultant, and the courts have not believed the League's consultants at any trial. So we've had that issue. And the fourth, an equally important issue, is Fair Share Housing is now at the table, which is a double-edged sword. They really don't care how much market rate, and Kevin Walsh may come down and hurt me at some point, and I've dealt with Kevin. In one of my many capacities, I am also the chairman of the local government law section of the State Bar Association right now, and I've been on multiple panels with Kevin since 2015. And the benefit is that they actually do believe in the creation of affordable housing, and they are trying to maximize it. However, their only concern is affordable housing. If a developer wants to come in and build it, they want to make sure the developer builds the affordable housing, and they're not nearly as concerned as how much market rate housing gets built on top of it. So their benefit is also their detriment. So we have actually had a pretty good relationship in this round with Fair Share Housing. They've been actually at times helpful, but they are ultimately desirous of building as much affordable housing as they can get. You have sewer in many parts, not all. You have water and utilities in many parts, not all. And they are obviously trying to maximize those. And the last item is we have 7 interveners in this litigation. And as the mayor alluded to, these are seven different developers, and actually at least one of them with multiple properties in town, who want to have their properties included in the obligation. So not only do we have to deal with Fair Share and their issues, we have to deal with the 7 builders and their issues. And as the mayor alluded to, we have had some success. We have ostensibly resolved 3.5 of the interveners. And you're going half? Yes. Because one of them has multiple properties we haven't totally resolved with. We have another 3.5 out there at least, and we have Fair Share. Our objective is to try to maximize what we have to build and minimize the number of units. And I can't go into great detail on them, folks, but I can tell you that's been the plan pretty much since the beginning of this process. We don't want to turn parts of town into affordable housing. We don't want to have affordable housing that is really a joke, and we don't want to see too many more market rate units built than we absolutely have to build. And that has been the charge that the 4 of us, and when I mean the 4 of us, myself, Ms. Beam, Mr. Ferrara, and Mr. Maskey have been charged with over the years. We've all, except for Jen, gotten grayer. I'm not quite sure how that happened. Through this process. But we understand that what we need to do for Hillsborough is get this thing resolved, get ourselves immunity through at least 2025, and try to avoid as much as possible overgrowth and overburden.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Beam, again, our affordable housing consultant, and then we'll get to the Assemblywoman.
Hi, everybody. So I'm sure that painted a very rosy picture of what we're up against moving forward. But I just want to take a step backwards and just talk a little bit about what exactly affordable housing is, because I know that over time there's been a misconception that affordable housing equals Section 8 or subsidized housing, and that is not the case. In fact, here you're in Region 3, as Eric had alluded to, Hunterdon, Middlesex, Somerset. So what takes place is that the median income of that region is evaluated, and a moderate income unit is 80% of median income, and low is 50% of median income. And whatever our number ultimately turns out to be at the end of these negotiations, 50% of the units have to be low and 50% of the units have to be moderate. But this region maintains the highest median income of all the regions in the state. So for example, a 4-person household in this region could make almost $90,000 a year and be considered moderate income. So I just want to kind of eliminate that fear that affordable housing equals Section 8 or what we saw in the late 60s, early 70s of housing projects. That's not really what this is. This is municipal employees, single parents, teachers that are just starting out. Those are the types of individuals that would fall into this income category. And in fact, the household income is a factor of your household size. So if your household size is 5 or 6 persons, the moderate income limit increases because there's additional individuals within that household. In addition, there are certain requirements that we have to meet. In order to get credit for an affordable housing unit, it has to have a deed restriction on it. And that deed restriction is for 30 years. And it would start from the time of a CO. So I'm sure that there are units located within this community as well as other communities that would fall within that affordable category in terms of price point, rents, etc. But if there are no deed restriction or what they call controls placed on those units, the township cannot take credit for those units. So that's kind of a downside. In addition, I've heard many individuals say, well, can't we satisfy our obligation with senior housing? That will be minimal impact on the school system and those types of things. Unfortunately, you can only utilize 25% of your obligation as senior. The balance has to be for families. And there are also requirements, minimum requirements for rental units. 25% of the units within your plan need to be rental units. But I will say that in this particular round, because Fair Share Housing Center has a seat at every table, they've been pushing for beyond the 25% in order for them to settle with the various municipalities. And we are able to get bonus credits, so I'm sure many of you have heard that if you have a family rental unit, they count for 2 for 1, right? So you get 2 credits for every 1 unit. But there's a limit on those as well. You can only take 25% of your total obligation as bonus. So every rental unit does not get that 2 for 1 benefit. I mean, we've heard it sitting up here when the developers come in to help us to say, oh, we're going to give you rental units, you're going to get 2 for 1, not knowing really where we are in the calculations or whether or not we've maxed out those bonuses already. I will tell you that we will be maxing out every opportunity we can to reduce the number of overall rooftops as part of this plan at the end of the day. So if we will max out the 25% bonus so that we can limit the number of actual units that need to be constructed on the ground. In addition, a couple of the other creative ways that we have in the past and continue to investigate and evaluate is every bedroom in a supportive needs household counts towards your affordable housing obligation. So here in the township, there are a number of those supportive needs housing scattered throughout. You probably don't even know that they're there because they look like single-family homes. They have 3 and 4 bedrooms in each of these facilities or these homes, and the town is able to take credit per bedroom. So if you have a 4-bedroom house, you would get 4 credits for 1 rooftop. So we're really trying to use whatever creative means we can to meet the obligation. We're certainly not looking to shirk our constitutional obligation, but at the same time to minimize the impact to you on the ground, because a lot of these decisions and discussions take place at like a 10,000-foot level, that you have all this land available, you should be providing all these units with little or no consideration for how are your roads going to handle it, how are your schools going to handle it, what is your infrastructure going to tell you. So that's kind of our role, and to try to minimize the impact of what this is ultimately going to be at the end of the day through these creative mechanisms. So that being said, the last little piece, because I know that we've been sitting here for a long time, and I know you guys have questions, but is that there are specific requirements that properties need to maintain in order to be considered for inclusion in a plan, and they call it available, meaning you can't put a piece of property in the plan that has a deed restriction or is on your Green Acres Rossi or is some other way encumbered so that it really is not developable. I think Eric alluded to that earlier. In the past, in order to satisfy the obligation, towns would put properties in their plan that they knew ultimately probably wouldn't get developed, but they just wanted to get through this process. So the regulations kind of caught up with that and now no longer allow that to happen. You have to demonstrate what they call site suitability. So the land has to be available, it has to be suitable, and what that means is it has to have access to sewer and water. So in many communities, I hear complaints that a lot of these affordable housing projects are located close to one another, and most of the reason for that is because that's where the available infrastructure is. If you take Hillsborough as an example, as you move out to the west, you do not have sewer and water out in that area. Those sites would not be considered suitable. Has to be developable, so you can't put a piece of property in the plan that's wet, 100% wetlands, or has stream corridors to where there's no developable land left. And it has to be approvable, meaning it can, at the end of the day, get through the regulatory process, whether it be here or any kind of outside agency approvals. It has to have the ability to be approvable. So in looking at, yes, you do have a number of properties within the community that meet that criteria, but there are a lot that do not. And so what we have been doing through this process is weeding out those properties that don't meet those 4 prongs and would not be considered eligible for inclusion, and try to help utilize that data to help us reduce our overall obligation. And we're still in the process of negotiating that out, which is why we don't really have any numbers for you this evening. But overall, I will say that the panel has been working diligently with Fair Share Housing Center. And for those of you who really don't know, because we work with these folks all the time, Fair Share Housing Center is a nonprofit advocacy group. It's really a bunch of lawyers, and their goal is to create affordable housing. That's their goal. All those other ancillary issues that come from this process, like I said, infrastructure, schools, what have you, is really not their focus. Their focus is the provision of units. So, we've been dealing with that issue as well and trying to protect the interests of the township, while at the same time trying to satisfy this process through the court. And with that, I guess I would turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jen. This time I'd like to introduce Assemblywoman Holly Schepisi. We appreciate her being here tonight. She's been an Assemblywoman since 2012. As noted earlier, she represents the 39th Legislative District, which includes portions of Bergen and Passaic County. She's earned her bachelor's degree in politics and psychology from Catholic University and a law degree from Fordham University in 1997. She recently began a new career as Vice President of Holy Name Medical Center and President of its foundation. Prior to this role, she was Special Counsel at the firm of Huntington Bailey LLP, where she practiced governmental law, corporate law, land use, employment matters, criminal defense, and structured finance. experienced in public issues. She served as the public defender for the Borough of Oakland from 2012 to 2014, and was a township attorney for Rivervale from 2007 to 2011. She's president of the New Jersey chapter of the Fordham Law Alumni Association, a board member of the Bergen County College Foundation, and also an advisory board member of SB One Bank. In the legislature, she serves as the Assistant Republican Leader for her caucus and serves as a member of the Assembly Education Committee, Health and Senior Services Committee, Housing and Community Development Committee, Joint Committee on Housing Affordability, the Joint Committee on Economic Justice and Equal Employment Opportunities Committee, and the New Jersey Legislative Select Oversight Committee. The Assemblywoman resides in Rivervale with her husband and 2 children. Assemblywoman Schapisi, thank you for joining us here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, and good evening, everybody. Actually, whenever somebody reads my bio, I become a little bit exhausted because it's a lot at the same time. And I do apologize for being a little bit late tonight. In addition to some traffic, I just started a new career, and my 7-year-old has been in the hospital the past several days, and we're also slated to go on a family vacation tomorrow, so it's been a little bit hectic. But this is a topic that is so important to our entire state that, notwithstanding everything going on in my personal life, it was worth the hour-and-a-half drive to get here to educate, discuss, talk about some of the real-life issues that your mayor, your council, your professionals are facing, and why it is so important for everybody to get involved. I have spoken all around the state on this issue. I actually ended up in the State Assembly because of this issue and representing my own community as a borough attorney. I had worked doing corporate mergers and acquisitions, outside general counsel for major corporations, put together multi-billion-dollar transactions around the world. I ended up in my own community, because I loved it, becoming the borough attorney, and ended up being one of the only communities in the state to receive what was called substantive certification back in round 3, where the mayor who represented our town at that community felt that we had a moral obligation to try to comply with the New Jersey affordable housing obligations. I am a Republican Assemblywoman. I was appointed by a Democratic mayor as his attorney, and I was tasked to figure out how we can comply with this thing called COA. We have been sued in builder remedy suits. We were a town in Bergen County that had 3 open golf courses, so we were prime open land territory. In all of the transactions that I had handled around the world, including putting together $1.5 billion telecom fund, I had never done a transaction as complicated as attempting to comply with the ridiculousness of the state of New Jersey. Okay? It was beyond the pale. And we went out, we aggregated properties in foreclosure, we partnered up with the Bergen County Housing Authority, we built 100% affordable housing projects, we bonded for it, we did everything. We had builder remedy suits, we went through mediations, we were challenged, we came out on the other side, and guess what? None of it mattered. And that's why I have become such a staunch advocate in changing what we do. Everybody is shocked when I tell them that I have been the outside general counsel for at least the past 6 years for the Bergen County Housing Authority, helping them build all of their 100% affordable housing projects in Bergen County. I am not against affordable housing. I am against the insanity of the process and the fact that the way that we are currently doing it in the state of New Jersey as legislators, we have failed the people of the state of New Jersey. Any member of the legislature who refuses to move forward legislation to make this process coherent, to make this process transparent, to help our municipalities, and to do something that actually helps rather than harms the state of New Jersey, no longer deserves to be in office. Everybody has buried their head in the sand. They all do. Look, there's a squirrel. It's Governor Christie's fault. It's Trump's fault. It's, 3 governors ago fault. It is our fault for not helping our mayors and council and not implementing legislation that anybody can follow. So I've spoken all over the state. What am I seeing? I'm seeing communities that have 8,000 people that are being forced to allow complexes that will immediately have a 3,000 population increase in their communities without regard to their schools, their infrastructure, their roads, their traffic, their environmental constraints, or anything else. We are the most densely populated state in the entire nation. We have #1 for Superfund sites in the entire nation. We have the highest rate of autism due to environmental issues. There was a report just yesterday that indicated for children under the age of 5, 1 in 35 will have autism in the state of New Jersey. So what have we done? We also have one of the highest rates of foreclosure and the highest rate right now, I think, out of all of our sister states, except for maybe New York, where we keep going neck and neck, of outmigration. So what are we doing? We're doubling down on bad policy. We are right now, based upon the settlements being entered into with fair share housing, potentially adding the size of Manhattan to the state of New Jersey at the exact same time that we have had a population increase, as documented by Rutgers, of 0.3% per year over the past 6 years. And that's the annual growth rate in our state, 0.3%, when you factor in outmigration, new births, and a whole host of other stuff. We are building as if we are going to have some sort of magical 30% population increase in this state that nobody can tell you where these people are coming from. Who's moving into our state? Where is this population increase coming from? And it's not smart. We have identified, and I've sat in more hearings on this, and probably even some of your professionals have, to understand who needs affordable housing in New Jersey. It is our seniors who, notwithstanding living frugally, paying off their mortgages, their property taxes are driving them out of the state. And so our seniors are trying to age in place. They want to stay around. They want to see their children, their grandchildren grow up. They want to be able to remain in their communities. What are we doing? We're putting phantom caps that you just heard from the professionals that is not only not permitting, but is actually disenfranchising our communities from building appropriate housing for our seniors. Nobody's aware of the fact that if you build affordable housing for your seniors in your community, you're not allowed to give them a preference. You're not allowed to say to the people who have lived in your community for 50, 60 years, who have been paying property taxes, allowing your communities to be vibrant and thrive. If you give them a preference to move into any senior affordable housing that you build, it no longer counts. It no longer exists towards your obligation. So that's #1. #2, I just told you the statistics on autism. Combined in that arbitrary cap are for special needs. You cannot build more than 25% of what you're doing to be senior, special needs, veteran housing. So that entire population is being artificially constrained by this arbitrary number, and that group Fair Share Housing that cares about affordable housing is forcing every municipality in the state who enters into their various settlement agreements to put a provision in that they will never allow more than 25% of the affordable housing built in their communities to go towards special needs or seniors, or it doesn't count, and they will not seek a waiver, which was historically available, to count that. So you've now actually harmed 2 populations that we know are being underserved and desperately seeking this housing in the state of New Jersey. Then you have those in transition. every person in this room knows somebody who's gone through a divorce, has had a medical issue, who has children in the school system, can't afford their home, trying to figure out how they get through for this temporary hiccup in their lives. We have no programs available for these people. We have nothing available that would enable our neighbors, our residents, to be able to remain within their own communities. So some of the legislative initiatives that we are working on would be to establish something, establish a state fund that would enable people who don't need affordable housing for 30 years, but may need something to stay in their homes, some sort of voucher, some sort of thing that would enable their kids to continue going to school. Then you have generational poverty. And that's what the entire premise, allegedly, of Mount Laurel and affordable housing is about. It's generational poverty and segregation. We have gone through and started to analyze and take a look at communities that have actually been compliant since Mount Laurel came about, compared to communities that haven't, to see if our current system has actually had any sort of measurable difference on segregation and generational poverty. The answer is it's been an abysmal failure. We have municipalities that have never complied, that have a more diverse population mix than those that have. And it's really fascinating because we speak about our schools, and we speak about, whether or not you can see diversity within school systems. And the very same group that has brought us fair share housing, COA, the current laws, Mount Laurel, as they're simultaneously pushing onto our communities high-density housing, saying that this has to occur because of social justice, because of segregation, because of generational poverty, they have simultaneously entered into and have a separate court action pretty much admitting that everything that they've done has failed, and are seeking an entire new recourse for our schools to force integration within schools through busing, through putting together kind of lotteries where we could build this in all of our communities, continue to have to pay some of the highest property taxes in the nation. And I know in my own community, 70% of my property taxes is just for my schools. And have my kids have to go into a lottery system to be able to use the schools that I'm paying for, as we are having to build massive high-density housing in my community, because by their own admission, the current system is not working and it has failed. So it's a lot to get your arms around. It's a lot to kind of think through. We have created a system in a lot of towns. I represent very wealthy communities. I also represent communities where people are barely getting by. School teachers working full-time, working second jobs, living in homes on 50 by 75-foot lots, 1,100, 1,200 square foot homes. Under no stretch of the imagination in any place in this country would they be deemed to be wealthy. They are paying $13,000 a year in property taxes, 70% of which are going to their school systems because we get no school funding. Their community just got hit as one of the towns where the last remaining parcel of open space in their community, the only farm that continued to exist, is being developed as we sit here tonight for high-density housing because they were told they don't have affordable housing in their community. Now, the project being developed is getting what's called a pilot agreement, payment in lieu of taxes. So what have we done? We are creating greater income inequality, greater disparity, and creating a larger schism in that community where the people who are already barely getting by, which has caused the number to go up for needing affordable housing in their community, are now going to be disproportionately having to pay more taxes because this farm and the people who live in it are going to be paying maybe about $1,200 a year in taxes to the community, while their neighbors who are living in the 1940s, 1950s split level are paying $13,000 a year. So this is one of the main reasons that I have been out there and speaking very vocally about how we have to do this differently. And for the first time ever, in the 7 years I've been in the Assembly, I have hope. I had dinner 2 weeks ago with the new president of the League of Municipalities, who is a Democratic mayor, who said this is her #1 priority, to get the legislation changed. I've been meeting with the Democratic mayor, who's the head of the Mayor's Association for the state of New Jersey as well. She, too, has said, we need to work together in a bipartisan matter to get this changed. We've been meeting with urban leaders who have said this entire policy has failed urban communities. What's occurred in urban communities? Everybody thinks this is supposed to be, the panacea. Urban communities have no affordable housing obligation whatsoever. So you take a place like Jersey City, which is this amazing rebirth and lots of building and everything else. Jersey City, in a couple-year period, issued 37,500 building permits for new residential units. Jersey City is building no affordable housing units during that period of time, but yet those 37,500 units were all being built pursuant to the pilot agreements that I referenced, payment in lieu of taxes. Builders were getting these huge tax incentives, were coming in, building luxury housing. Jersey City, by its own admission, currently receives about $100 million in excess school funding per year that it's not entitled to, because it has failed to do a revaluation of any of its properties since some of the people in this room were born. So it has an artificially deflated property value, which means that it's receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in school funding that it may not be able to get. So now they start building all these luxury apartments. And they're giving these developers 30, 40 years of tax-free pilot agreements. No money going to their schools, no money really going to the county, money going to Jersey City, and not building any affordable housing. A lot of those 37,000 units being built, guess what? COA, fair share housing, and the courts for these random numbers that are being placed in our communities takes 20% of what should have been built, although they have no obligation, divides it up and sends it to the suburban communities. So we now are having to build Jersey City's affordable housing that their builders don't have to build while receiving tax breaks. And we're not just getting the affordable units, as you heard from Eric, we are getting all of the market rate units as well. So we're doubling down. And my question is, where are the environmentalists? Everybody's screaming about wind and solar and Tesla and rechargeable cars. Every last inch of space in this state is being built. I recently did a project with Rutgers where they started to plot out what was going to remain. What resources continue to exist in New Jersey? And before all of our communities started getting hit with these building obligations, based upon a report that they did, we would have been out of natural resources by 2050. And that was at the then rate of growth. Under the current rate of growth, we may be out of natural resources in 5 years. But nobody knows, because fair share housing, because the courts, because the towns, nothing is being kept track of. We have asked, the state legislature has asked, DCA has asked, a housing mortgage finance agency has asked. They refuse to provide us with the data. We have no idea of how many projects have simultaneously been approved in this state at the same time. Where are your legislators? Everybody's done a duck and cover. For any person who claims to care about good government, any person who claims to care about the environment, I would call BS on them and ask them why they have not done anything to take a position on this. Where are your good government people? This entire process has created shadow government. It is the worst of the worst. All around the state, I talk to mayors, council, planning board members, attorneys who have been prohibited by courts, by their professionals, from speaking to the public about the largest thing impacting their communities ever. They are being told that if they actually say anything, they could jeopardize the settlement. If they get involved, if they talk to members of their community about, hey, we may have to double the size of our school, we may have to do this, they are being prohibited from doing so. So for everybody who champions Oprah and OPMA and all this other stuff and open government, where are they? This is the largest thing to impact almost every community in the state, and they are being silenced from being able to discuss numbers, settlements, anything. It's insane. And not to mention, and I'm not saying here, but in a lot of places in the state, we're also known as one of the most corrupt states in the nation. We have organizations that are being funded by the very developers that are coming in and building on every last acre that exists in the state, and are the donors to the organizations who are fighting our towns, forcing us to enter into these agreements. It's nonsensical. So the deed restriction requirement, you heard about that as well. One of the things we're trying to fight for is let's count what actually is affordable housing. Everybody's concerned about Section 8 housing. Oh, I don't want that in my community. Is there any person in this audience who doesn't think that Section 8 housing is affordable housing? Okay. It does not get counted towards the obligations in the state. Section 8 housing in a lot of communities is not deemed to be part and parcel of what gets counted. You have trailer homes in the state that don't get counted towards what is deemed to be affordable housing. You have the various homes that I spoke about on 50 by 75 foot lots, 1,100 square foot homes that in any other capacity would be viewed as affordable housing that get discounted because they don't have that magical deed restriction on them. We just passed a bill a couple of weeks ago, came out of the housing committee I sit on, to do these micro homes, tiny little houses, try to incentivize building municipalities, do these very small homes on municipally owned lands. Wouldn't count towards the affordable housing obligation. I said, what's the point of doing them then? Why even bother with the legislation? So, what can you do? We have a whole host of bills that we've been championing, and it's plans to actually fix our affordable housing crisis. And unfortunately, there's been little interest from the legislature, and I think some people just don't understand it because it's so complex. I think for others, they're getting payouts from builders and various people who want to see the status quo. And I also think that some people are afraid. When I first started going down this path talking about policy, I had op-eds put against me saying that I was a racist, that I didn't want those people in my backyard, that I was the worst of the worst. You name it, I was called it. And at first, it was pretty devastating. At the same time that I was being called those things, half of my household was a blended household. I'm somebody who will welcome, embrace anybody who wants to live in my neighborhood. I could care less what religion, what race, what background. And for a lot of members of the legislature, being put into that bullseye and having kind of the bullying tactics of, you want to talk about policy, so that means that you're a horrible human being who hates entire classes of people. It's a tough place to go. Once you've been called it enough times, you no longer care. And you really kind of talk about what is the policy, how is this failing both urban and suburban communities? How can we bring people to the table who really care about changing and shifting something that obviously hasn't worked for about 40 years in the state to come up with a better way? And that's what we've been doing. And so we've amassed a really awesome group of people, bipartisan, urban, suburban, to start having open, honest conversation about how do we do this better? How do we do it before we build out every last available space in the state? How do we do it so that we have open, better government? And how do we do it so that we are providing housing for those who need it the most while attempting to actually achieve the goals of integration? It's not an easy task, but it's something that we must do, and we must stop burying our heads in the sand. So we have eliminate the builder's remedy. Get rid of it. It is a proverbial gun to the head of everybody sitting up here who have no options and no choices to do what's best for your community because they're being told that they have to make the best decision of a lot of worse choices. And I've seen it destroy communities all around the state. I've seen friendships deteriorate on mayors and council, and it has nothing to do with political party. I've seen Democratic mayors get recalled and drop out. I've seen Republicans, brawl and no longer talk. It's just bad governance, and it's something that we as a legislature have failed our mayors and council on. We want to ensure that we can plan properly. Let's do this on a statewide basis. We are putting some of these complexes into communities that have no jobs, no public transportation, no ability to absorb, and that's part of it. When we talk about who's going to move into some of these larger complexes, if you have no transportation, if you have no jobs, if you have no means of people getting around. I live in a community that has stripped out everything because we get no money from the state of New Jersey. We are a community that has some wealth. We're a community that also has a lot of people struggling. It's a big mixture in my town. And there's no public transportation. You pay a fortune for your property taxes, your car insurance, your gas. You're driving 20, 30, 40 minutes to get to a job. Your kids are going to the school. If they play sports, you're paying out of pocket $1,000, per every several months to just have to pay for what they do, paying for our own garbage pickup, paying for everything out of pocket. How is a family who can barely get by, who's looking for affordable housing, going to be able to afford any of the things in our community? And these are the sorts of discussions that nobody has had. There's an assumption that everybody who lives in an urban community somehow, some way wants to abandon the place they live in and come and move to a suburban community that they know nobody in. And I've had several of my colleagues who go, I was born and raised in Hoboken. I want to stay in Hoboken. This is where my friends, my family, my children are. Why are you telling me I've got to go move to Park Ridge or Hillsborough or wherever the heck you're going to place me? because I'm now being forced out of my community because everything being bought up around me by builders is pilot agreements and tax incentives, and they're now trying to force me out because they want $7,000 a month for a luxury apartment where I live. That's what's going on in New Jersey right now. So whatever ends up taking place in Hillsborough, don't blame the people sitting up here. Blame the people in Trenton for their inaction and for not getting behind doing something while we can. And I know they have no easy choices to make. They are struggling, talking to their professionals, getting guidance. These are essentially volunteer positions. Nobody sitting up here is getting rich on what they are doing. They're sitting up here giving up nights at home with their wives, their children, their husbands, because they care about the community that they live in, and they're trying to make the best decisions on behalf of all of you sitting here. But we are not helping them at the state of New Jersey. So if you care about it, if you care about Hillsborough, start reaching out. Ask your legislators. Ask Steve Sweeney. Ask Craig Coughlin. Start reviewing these bills. Hold public hearings. I don't care if they're my ideas. I don't care if they're somebody else's. I don't care if it's a Democrat who steals every bill that I've put forth. We have to do something different than what we are. So if anybody has any questions, I'm here. And yes.
Why don't we just go march down?
Okay.
They come up to the mic.
So we're going to open up. We're going to ask if you want to ask a question. We're going to get you up to the microphone. I just want to kind of wrap up, and then we'll open the Q&A. So thank you, Assemblywoman, for those comments. We wanted to give you kind of a full scope of what we're dealing with at the local level. How those requirements have developed over time. What's happened within our community as we build towards fulfilling our obligations, and I think the wrap-up of how the state decision-making, or lack thereof, how some of the process that has happened down in Trenton that is now kind of flowing down. And I think we all are in the space of recognizing the need for housing to support the most vulnerable in our community. Housing to allow, as we said earlier, teachers and young people starting out the opportunity to buy a home or live in a community where they grew up, live with where their family and friends are. But the process is one that is really difficult to handle at the it's difficult at the state level, and that's flowing down to what we have to deal with. We are managing to fulfill our obligations. We're working with all of the elements that have been mandated upon us to eventually get to the point where we have a settlement that is one that will meet our obligations, but that doesn't lessen the impact that those decisions are going to have, not just for Hillsborough, but for Somerset County and realistically for the balance of the state. So I hope between the various speakers up here, you've gotten a sense of the issue within New Jersey, the issue that we're dealing with at a local level, how your community is being impacted by that, and the steps that we're taking to try to manage the process in the most responsible and prudent way that we can, given the parameters that we're operating under. I'd like to thank everyone that was up on the panel today, out on the dais here. I hope you got a good oversight of what's happening throughout the entire state from the Assemblywoman. Thank you very much for your comments. And we're going to open it up for Q&A. I would ask, if you want to ask a question, please come forward to the microphone. I just ask that you give your name and address for the record, and we'll answer as best we can whatever questions you may have. So, sir, if you had a question, please just come to the microphone and ask us, so everyone can hear. It's just so everyone can hear the question, that's all.
Why can't we march down on Trenton? Talk to Mendez and have him straighten it all out.
I would welcome you to do so. It's something that there are a couple of groups that are organizing right now. There's a couple of web things, Facebook pages with residents who have, there is a petition right now with several thousand signatures from all around the state, people reaching out to their local representatives. And there has been discussion about creating a group of people to come down together to insist that we at least start having the discussions and the
Right.
talks about how to implement it. I mean, some of the legislative initiatives are very basic and things that you would go, determine if towns can afford new housing. And it would force the state and courts to give primary consideration to current population size, infrastructure, water, sewer capacities, school class size, school services, impact on volunteer and staffed ambulatory services and fire departments, police departments, public transportation, and traffic. Seems to be kind of a reasonable bill to move forward.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why I'd say, why don't we just all march down? Why don't we
Yep.
just
Yeah.
make it public, put it on Facebook,
Yep. And
and interrupt them, would do it every time they have a session.
Yeah, and by the way, all of those requirements that were just outlined are essentially the same thing that every local planning board has to take into consideration when they're looking at some new site plan. Those are, that's not rocket science, it's basic,
Well, if-
basic planning and
If
governance.
we go down to Trenton, we can have all that shut down while they're listening to our,
there's currently a Facebook group called New Jersey NJ Stop the Madness of Overdevelopment. And it has about 1.5 thousand members. Go on it. They're very, they're very active. They're from all parts of the state, seeing what's going on within their communities. And what people don't understand is, regardless of what takes place right now, the way that it currently is, every municipality is going to be having to go through this again in only a couple of years.
yeah.
So it doesn't, there's no way to ever fully comply because the obligations keep kind of rolling on top of one another. So even if you build everything that you've agreed to, you still have obligations that you're going to have to comply with in a couple of years' time. So that's why it's so important, regardless of whether or not your community has entered into a settlement agreement, to get out in front of this and demand action by the legislature to actually do our jobs. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Does anyone address
Yes.
Good evening, Tom Isabelli, 9 Upper NESHANIC Court. So I have a little bit of a different avenue that I'd like to take. So I'm 25. I work with those, so I work for a state agency, and we work with those with disabilities. And we have 18 local offices throughout the state, and I've traveled quite extensively to many of these different areas throughout the state. And I'm still living at home, so there is that sense that I have a desire to move out. I want to be able to spread my wings, but I feel it very tough to be able to do that. I love this town. I grew up here. I graduated the high school, and would like to live here, but I know it's, at this point in my life, I just could not afford to live here. And I'm sitting here, and I tend to agree with what has been said, and I'm in amazement, truly eye-opening to learn that areas like Jersey City will not build any affordable housing units. I was a candidate 3 separate times for the school board and was unsuccessful, but it was one of those issues that I talked about, at public meetings. Just the other night, we had a school board meeting where I spoke about the need for us to get our fair share of school funding, as well as, getting under control this idea that we need to build all these units. I am not one of those, I'm an environmentalist to an extent. I'm not one of those like big green thumb, drive a Prius type folks, but I really do enjoy and love living in an area like this where I can go, and I drive to work every day to Trenton, and I'm so blessed to come back here because I drive by farms. And my father, who has since passed, we would drive up past this farm, and he would do all these cow sounds, moo sounds, and it's just something, like even this morning, I slowed down this morning and listened to the cows and just watched them graze on the grass. And there's one farm just as you pass Clover Hill Church into Hunterdon County, and it's beautiful. And I don't want us to lose that here in Hillsborough and surrounding areas. And I'm actually quite surprised that our local, one of our assembly people who actually lives here in Hillsborough, maybe I'm wrong, I don't see him here tonight, I don't know.
Roy Fryman? Roy Fryman lives here.
Yeah.
So, and this is a public meeting, so anyone is welcome to show, and especially, I'm not trying to knock him because I don't know him personally, and I don't think that it's fair, but I look at it and I have to question why he's not here, especially someone who lives. As I said, it's an open forum, it's a public forum. Even if he weren't invited, it's still a public forum. He's still a citizen and a resident of this town. He should have showed up. That's just my opinion. You could take it or leave it, whatever. Thank you very much. I don't know that there's not, I don't know there's not much to respond to,
Yeah,
but
well, I do want to respond just a little bit to sort of how you started your comments, because I don't want you to leave with the impression that any of us are opposed to creating an environment that allows people that are starting out in their careers, or people that are sort of dedicating themselves to some type of public service, whether it's through working in Trenton or working in the school systems, or people starting out as police, whatever it may be. Those are the types of careers that we want to be able to establish in a community, and those are what the affordable housing, in my view, the affordable housing requirements, those are the types of careers that should be supported by that process. And I think some of the details that Jen had provided gave that vision, that when you look at what the median income are, especially for somewhere in Somerset County like this, it's a fairly high median threshold. So it does create opportunities for people, and we want to see that. I think the message that is being delivered is, how do we manage that in the best way possible so that we are not, the magnitude of the problem does not make the situation worse to the point where it does force out people that ultimately want to live here, and especially those that may be starting out in a career, or seniors, or those that
I appreciate that, and also I look at it and I'm saddened to hear that those with disabilities or veterans or seniors couldn't be considered counted towards that. That really surprised me, quite frankly.
One other just item is that even achieving the goals that were just spoken about, no preference is permitted for our suburban communities to be able to give it to our teachers, people working in our community, our DPW workers. We are not permitted to give that preference. Urban communities are. Urban communities can get funding from the state to build that sort of housing and give 100% preference to people working within the urban communities. Suburban communities, if you do that, that housing no longer counts towards your obligation.
Why was that I don't mean to monopolize, but I'm just curious. Why was that decided? Why was that determined that was okay? Or even, people talk
Welcome to New Jersey.
People talk about fairness. They talk, as you alluded to, Assemblywoman, everyone talks about fairness, and then they're not very fair. But
Take a place like Hoboken. Hoboken right now has the largest population of millionaires, has a higher per capita income than the place that I live in, has no affordable housing obligations, and receives about $10,000 in funding per student, as my town receives about $400 per student, inclusive of special needs. There is nothing about equity and fairness in the state that takes place. So a lot of this has nothing to do with sound policy, sound fiscal policy. It's just stuff that's been there for a long period of time, and nobody has the intestinal fortitude to actually sit down and do what makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thanks, Tom.
Can I just say, real quick? So, I just heard our elected representatives' names mentioned, so I just wanted to point this out, that we purposely did not invite Senator Bateman, who's a Republican, and Assemblyman Zwicker and Assemblyman Fryman, who are Democrats, to this. We just didn't do that. We were talking about what's happening here in Hillsborough and invited a special guest. But that does not mean that none of them don't care about the issue. I want to be very clear. Senator Bateman, for years, he's been in the legislature longer, has introduced numerous pieces of legislation on this. You have, when Jack Chitterelli was in the legislature, held mayor town halls throughout the district trying to talk to people about this, introduce legislation. And at our last council meeting, Assemblyman Moore Fryman gave us a piece of legislation which he was dropping, which will be introduced when the legislature comes back in May. So just because someone's not here, whether it be Senator Bateman or Assembly members, does not mean they don't care about this issue. I just felt that was necessary to mention for the record.
Hi. Good evening. Mike Sigalski, 22 Piney Woods.
My daughter's at Delaware right now as well. So.
My daughter, a proud papa of a Delaware graduate. Thank you all for your service to the state, to the town. I'm a 30-year resident of Hillsborough. The only thing that'll keep me out of Hillsborough, probably my kids moving. I have my sons moved to Maryland, so chasing his love. But I had sort of a topic to bring up, but what you brought up is mind-boggling. Every politician lives in New Jersey, so there's obviously other reasons why they wouldn't be supporting everything you brought up, and I appreciate everything. It's mind-boggling, the statistics and what you've brought up with the big cities and all that. On a personal note, I believe in the town it's well documented, some of the issues on Piney Woods, especially the wetlands and many of our backyard, my beautiful backyard that's 1/3 underwater now with any rain. I do know at one time one of the properties on Elmo Road was listed as a possibility for a affordable housing project. Does wetlands, things like that, will that preclude?
Yes.
Oh.
So, I'm sorry. Frank, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff, please.
So when I was talking earlier about sites had to be approvable, so this process does not circumvent the DEP's regulatory jurisdiction. So anyone that were to come in for any development, whether it be through this process or a regular site plan subdivision application, would have to comply with DEP regulations, and this is no exception. So if the site is 100% wet, then it would not meet those ABLs that I talked about earlier. It would not be developable and approvable.
Oh, even though if it was on the list. But I think you explained when I was sitting in the audience that you sort of explained it. I know that it was on the list at one time, but obviously conditions have probably changed that property itself.
I don't know the specific property that you're talking about, but I will say that just because there is any kind of environmentally constrained land on a piece of property, if it's a piece of the property, the balance remains developable.
Yeah.
It would only be unsuitable if it was constrained in its entirety.
Okay.
So, and that's not to say that any kind of developer can go to the DEP and seek whatever permits necessary, some being which they can average buffering or fill wetlands or those types of things. So those are things that would typically get fleshed out at the planning board process.
Okay.
But if a site is completely encumbered, then it would not meet those ABLs and it would not be considered a suitable site.
Okay.
Okay, it just as one follow-up to that, because we've been seeing this issue all around the state. There have been a couple of recent lawsuits where there were properties in sensitive areas where the courts have actually overturned and have granted the approvals. One of the most inane parts of all of this, and I went to introduce, it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I wanted to introduce legislation particularly on this issue. I represent a lot of communities that are subject to significant flooding. I mean, massive flooding. We implemented a program called Blue Acres, where the state spends millions upon millions of dollars in buying back properties in flood-prone areas to return them back to their natural state for environmental purposes, because there is no place for the groundwater to go anymore in those communities, because we are the most highly densely populated state in the country. So I said, well, let's do something that makes sense, and let's have that if a community is having to buy back properties and return them to their natural state because the groundwater can't go anywhere, that they get a proportionate reduction of their affordable housing high-density obligations for future building in the communities. I was told that would be deemed unconstitutional unless we put that obligation on surrounding towns. So, I mean, that's how nutty it is right now. We have communities that are literally underwater for portions of the year, if it rains, being told that they have to build 700 units of new housing.
Amazing.
And certainly anyone here, right, if you live here, you know that there are times of the year or after certain storms that you almost can't get out of town, right? And
Absolutely.
part of the process that is frustrating for us is that even, the requirements that we have to try to manage, there's no overriding process that looks at all of the surrounding areas and says, okay, we're doing this and you're doing this. How does that ultimately affect, each of the border areas? How does it affect where runoff is going? How does it exacerbate the flooding problem that we're already dealing with? There's no overarching view, and it's something that, as we were indicating earlier, the stuff you would do normally in any type of planning board process is not being evaluated at a macro level, and it's a problem.
Very handcuffed.
Yeah.
And
You can't put up a fence for your house that you've been in for 40 years, but you can build 900 units. I mean, that's pretty much what's going on in the state.
And I was told at one time I was limited on what I might be able to do to start getting water off my property because of that, but it sounds like it doesn't work the opposite way.
Yep.
So, and then the last question, I thank you again for your, this is very enlightening. If an affordable housing development is put in a certain neighborhood, do they try? Will you try to put the next one as spread out as opposed to continuing them instead of just keep putting them on? I know Amwell Road is subject to a lot of them, but that's the last question I leave with. And thank you again.
We are endeavoring to spread out, and I put this in quotes, the pain throughout the township. However, we can only spread it where people will build it. We are, part of the indication we've had conversation about this evening is realistic development potential. The problem that we're trying to avoid is one of the things that the Assemblywoman commented about, which is the going forward. We are trying very hard in this round to minimize the impact of the going forward. One of the reasons why a number of towns have had a problem in this round relative to prior is that they put together a bunch of properties that in no way, shape, or form would actually build, and they didn't. Now, part of the reason that that's not going to occur this time is fair share housing, because before they had no part of it, and and others have allowed to build. I can't resist pointing out one of my favorite affordable housing sites in Hillsborough Township. Drive up 206, look to the right, look at Lowe's, and look for the affordable housing. That was an affordable housing site in round 2. That was approved not for affordable housing, but for shopping. That was part of round 2. That's not going to happen in round 3/4 because nobody's going to permit it. The courts won't permit it. Fair share isn't going to permit it. So what we've tried to do within the context of where we can build and who will build and where they will build is to try to limit the impact of putting it in one area. Now, I will tell you that some things are going to get put in the Amwell Road area. It's a major thoroughfare running east-west and Hillsborough Township, just like you're seeing stuff being built up and down 206. Those are the two major thoroughfares in town. But we are trying very hard to get it moved around in various spots all over, to the extent we can do it. We also have to be realistic that we expect to get it built. Because if we don't get it built come 2025, when this fund all comes up again, here we go, well, Site A didn't build, and Site B didn't build, and Site C didn't build, so now you've got on top of whatever obligation may or may not occur, as the Full Employment Act for the planners and the attorneys, and the legislatures, and the legislators, you've got the 200 units you didn't build in the last round. So we're trying to produce realistic situations that are not just realistic in terms of potential, but realistic in actually getting built. So when this is over, we don't end up with another round of multiple hundred. For example, I'll give you one other example, and it hasn't come up tonight, but the Township Committee needs to get applauded for. We managed to keep probably one of the largest pieces of property in the whole town out of the whole affordable housing discussion. We told the Fair Share Housing we're buying it for open space. And guess what we did? In conjunction with the county. That's what is the piece of property between Ann Van Middlesworth and Mountain View, which is euphemistically known as around here as Hillsborough Properties. That could have generated in and of itself over 500 affordable units
Easily.
just for that site alone throughout the town. Forget whether it was built there or not. That site is not being considered. It's an open space property. It's owned by government, and they're not counting it. And Fair Shares had no problem with it, and everybody's gone along with it. So we've done considerable actions, this committee, to try to reduce the number, whatever that may be. And we're trying to then spread it out to get around to answering as much around town as we can get to spread it around, considering people still have to build it.
Kieran Deshpande, Crowell Road, Hillsborough, New Jersey. I grew up in Essex County, 99% developed town. I remember when Jersey City and Hillsborough were dumps, not Hillsborough, sorry, Hoboken. Hoboken. Hoboken, they were considered dumps. No one wanted to live there. I mean, we'd go there on weekends shopping because they had Indian grocery stores there. And I hated going there because it was just a mess. Now, I mean, you know the story now. Thank you very much for informing us today. It was very enlightening. I moved to Hillsborough in 2000 before I had kids. I've raised my kids here. I love the community, and I'd like to keep it that way. I know things change. I mean, they're going to have to, but they have to change within reason. The question I have is, with the properties that are being developed right now, it's pretty specific, but just it gives me an idea on how things work. Like one of the properties I read in a planning board meeting where they were asking for the builder was asking for economic hardship to get around some of the zoning. I mean, what's that about?
Well, let me address a couple things. I can't resist. I apologize.
It's been cut off.
Yeah, finally been cut off. Let me make one correction to the Assemblywoman's comments. I am Jersey City's Tax Appeal Council, and there was a reval, and I can tell you that because they've been flooding in the tax appeals.
But what year?
2 years ago. I don't disagree. I don't disagree.
What was your question again?
The question was the economic hardship. There are two parts to that. There was a generic economic hardship waiver that any developer, whether they're building affordable or not here in Hillsborough, can request from the planning board for purposes of certain reports. Now, when it comes to affordable housing, this is the other problem. Oh, look at all the things we're doing for you. We're building affordable housing. You can't make us do certain things because we are out of the goodness of our hearts building the affordable. So we should get consideration for things that you make us do that we don't necessarily have to do because it's cost generative, and we're providing affordable housing, which therefore eats into our profits, and therefore you can't make it through the cost generative. We have had conversations, and this is a send out to Mr. Maskey and his people. We have had every developer who comes into town, whether they build affordable or not, who cries. Some of them better than others. Planning has regularly and repeatedly, as has the planning board, as has the committee, as have the professionals, listened to the crying and said, that's lovely. But no. You have to build roads that actually meet the standards. You have to actually plant trees. You actually have to follow the DEP regulations. And so far, and David can correct me,
Knock on wood.
though they have been unhappy about it,
They have done it.
they've all gone along with it.
Yeah.
So they may want an economic waiver and a cost generator, and we may still find a developer or two along the way who's going to. But we're going to do our damnedest, pardon my French, to prevent them from telling you all that we want an entirely barren piece of property without a tree on it, though we're required to do trees. Even the ones who come in for tree mitigation are now talking about not only planting trees on their property, they're talking about planting trees on other properties they own to make up the difference. So we're going to do our hardest to deal with the fact that, yes, the courts have ruled that you cannot be overly restrictive. You cannot make them do things to generate costs that you don't require of others. But the crying is going to be limited as far as possible.
And part of that process is really, as we were talking earlier about the ongoing discussions with the interveners, is that when you have developers that are coming forward saying, I can solve your problems as it relates to affordable housing, but by the way, I need economic hardship waiver in order to do that, that's a tough argument, for us to be willing to accept. So generally, there's a pretty good amount of pushback that, and those issues do tend to go away. There might be some, there are some within the within ordinances that, whether it may be for tree mitigation, that there could be some things that are permissible, but generally the economic hardship that I think they would like to come in for is generally not granted.
I'll be quick. Sean Lapani, Lindstrom Drive, also committee member, but I just want to thank Mr. Pease for coming and sharing light as being on the planning board for years, getting these same questions, but you stole my thunder with the open space. Hillsborough, really only you can do is try and reduce the inventory. The county in Hillsborough for years has actively and aggressively looked to buy open land and open space to preserve, Mr. Zabelli, those farms that your father dug with the mowing, and to preserve the rural part of Hillsborough. And that's really, other than the planning, is what we're using your tax dollars to, and the county's tax dollars to, is to reduce that inventory. And I just wanted to bring it up, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Frank Herbert, Bad Drive. Thanks for coming tonight. Hope you have a relaxing vacation. Okay, so one thing I don't understand, you said the state's not growing, well, virtually isn't growing. Where's the market? How can there be a market for new construction? Where are the people coming from?
And that is a big unknown right now. That is a question that we have asked for a moratorium on everything, going forward for a short period of time, just to do an analysis of what we even have.
But there has to be
And for the first time in a long time, banks are starting to pull money. The type of product being built throughout the state is mostly the same sort of product, which is all, luxury apartment type of rentals without any real housing that's being built, or transitional type of housing. Not everybody wants to live in a rental apartment, and not everybody wants to live in a rental apartment all over the state of New Jersey. So it's something whereby there is no current count as to the total number of approved units all throughout the state. We have people working on it. We have the League of Municipalities working on it. We're pulling all of the court settlements. There's a lot of negotiations taking place where nobody has the numbers. But the population growth is very well documented, and we're building to far exceed that. So we're either going to crash our real estate market in the state, which is currently a very perilous state to begin with financially, or, maybe we'll get an exodus from Manhattan because, our public transportation, no, I mean, and I'm not trying to be glib about it, but there really is no firm answer to your question.
But, the builders wouldn't be building if people aren't buying, right? Unless
You have some national builders with very deep pockets. You also have some people who have gotten into this, who are smaller people. When you say that, look at how many times we've had crashes, even while I've been alive. I'm 47. And, I've seen a lot of real estate markets tank where a lot of people far, quote unquote, smarter than myself have extended themselves into real estate and found themselves going, oh, for the love of God, what have I done? And so nobody's really looking at what the global market in New Jersey is right now. Everybody's just trying to be first to the punch to get their product up, hoping that they're going to make the profit.
Okay, second question. Am I right? Is this going to be more than a law that has to be passed? Since the Supreme Court's involved, isn't it going to be a constitutional change?
We've been pushing for a constitutional amendment that would take it out of the Constitution. We are the only state in the entire nation that has a constitutional obligation such as this. California doesn't have it. New York doesn't have it. Connecticut doesn't have it. Any of the blue states that are out there with us, nobody has it. We are the only ones that have this constitution. And I can't tell you how many judges I've sat down and had one-on-ones with, including ones that are hearing these cases, going, for the love of God, would the legislature please do their job? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question because our professors are about to bill us for another hour, and we're pretty frugal.
Okay, then I'll speak extra slow.
Thank you.
Jane Statz, 101 Devonshire Court. I am on the school board, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not representing the school board. Actually, to piggyback on what Frank just said, it sounds like everybody's for affordable housing, but obviously there's a lot of poor regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So why is there so much resistance on the part of, I'm speaking to you, Assemblywoman, on the part of your fellow legislators on making reasonable changes to these requirements?
Honestly, it really goes to any time there's ever been discussion about making any changes to this, the tactic has been to come out swinging, saying that the legislature doesn't care about people. And it's such a complicated issue. I have 7 years of higher education. I've been practicing law for 22 years. It took me years to understand this. For a lot of my colleagues, it's a part-time position. A lot of my colleagues don't have the same expertise in this area and don't understand it. And it's not denigrating anybody, it's the practicalities of it. And they're not necessarily hearing back from their constituents, because for a lot of constituents and a lot of residents, they're only now starting to wake up and go, whoa, how'd that end up, in my community? Or what's going on here? Or, how do I get involved? And so it's something where I think it's just starting to get the public pressure and acknowledgement and feedback that this is very important, both from being able to provide appropriate affordable housing, as well as we don't want severe overdevelopment. And so I think it's been a whole host of issues.
So do you find hope in that as the public has become more aware and concerned that maybe they'll be pushed to take some action?
The hope is the combination of the League of Municipalities, the Conference of Mayors, and the public, where it has now become a true bipartisan issue, and it's not a Republican-Democrat issue, will ensure some sort of change.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just one last point on that. I think the issue is coming more and more to the forefront. I think both from the municipalities raising the issue, I think constituents are starting to be more well-versed on the topic. As I said earlier, I think the concept is quite noble, and you say affordable housing. How can you be against, especially in a state like this where, let's face it, housing is not particularly affordable in some cases? It sounds great, but when you look at the process that we've gone through to get us to the point where we are now, it just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Administrator Ferreira and I were in Trenton 2 weeks ago for the Mayor's Legislative Day, and it's an annual event that some of the legislators do, and I can tell you the main topic of discussion amongst all of the mayors and the legislators that were there was, how are you going to fix my affordable housing problem? So there is a constant push at the municipal level within, pushing back on Trenton to say, help us with this. We're not opposed, but we need help. And so it's starting to get some traction in terms of the understanding of the impact it's really having on everyone. So I share some hope, maybe not optimism, but certainly hope. Okay, I'd like to thank all the residents here that came out tonight. I know it's an important issue. We wanted to be able to provide this forum to give you some answers, some understanding about the process that we've gone through. I would certainly like to thank all of our panelists and guests that are up here today for sharing some of their knowledge and expertise with you. And we certainly would welcome any further feedback, questions, ideas, thoughts you may have on this topic. I certainly don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone up here has all the answers, but I think we're starting to formulate a coalition of answers that hopefully will lead to a resolution at some point. So I thank you very much for being here. If you have, anyone didn't want to ask a question at the microphone, would like to come up and talk afterwards, I'm sure we'll have a couple of minutes with some folks up here if you'd like to. Thank you and good night.